Welcome to the People's Podcast with Mike Huckabee.
Welcome to this edition of the People's Podcast. Hello, I'm Mike Huckabee, and very special show lined up for today. We're going to be talking a lot about what's happening in the Middle East. I'm going to give you a firsthand perspective. Later in the podcast, I have a really delightful interview that I'm looking forward to so much, and even more importantly, I'm looking forward for you. I want you to really clue in on the conversation that I'll be having with Alex Marlow. And he's got a brand new blockbuster book out called Breaking the News. And in it, he really does lay bare what's going on with modern media and how they are manipulating the news, not reporting it, but manipulating it. And the result of that is a very damaged republic. And we'll talk about that with Alex Marlow a little later. Well, there's no way you can miss what's happening in the Middle East these days, but what I fear is that the information that you're getting is anything but accurate. In fact, not only do I believe that it's often inaccurate, but it's so slanted toward the side of the leftist, in this case, the pro-Palestinian wing of the Democrat Party, Bernie Sanders, AOC, Rashida Tlaib, the whole squad. But the bigger challenge that we face is there's a lot more at stake than a couple of skirmishes between Israel and Gaza. And I want to give you some background. So hang with me on this. I'm going to give you some perspective that I promise you're not going to get anywhere else. Now, a little bit of background that you need to know as to where I'm coming from. I've been going in and out of the Middle East since 1973, 48 years. I have been traveling to the Middle East, to Israel. So many times I've lost count. It's probably 100 or more. But I've also been to Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt. I've been to all over many of the Arab countries, Qatar, Saudi Arabia. So it's not like I've limited myself only to see firsthand what's going on in Israel, but throughout the Middle East. And until COVID, I was going 5 or 6 times a year. I have personally escorted, taken on trips. I can't imagine how many, but several thousand, maybe tens of thousands of people, because I take trips to Israel every year, usually 2 or 3 guided trips, plus I'm there several more times speaking and meeting with officials and so on. But I've been doing that since 1981. So I just want to give you a little bit of perspective. That's 40 years, if you're counting. So what I'm about to tell you is not based on things I've read in the New York Times or the Washington Post. It is not information that I've received from watching what I call BSNBC, or for that matter, Fox News. I'm not telling you things that I have picked up from the media. I'm telling you things that I have observed firsthand in the 48 years of going to the Middle East. And I want you to keep that in mind, because I know there are some people who say, well, you're just pro-Israel. I admit that I am. But I didn't get there because somebody paid me. I've never received a dime from the Israeli government. Granted, I have a lot of friends in the Israeli government, relationships that I've built over the years, specifically and particularly with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who I've been friends with for 25 or so years. But this is not about relationships that I have. Those relationships came as a result of my observations. And what I want you to understand is that I've also built relationships with people on the Palestinian side. Not as many, granted, because they don't want to have a relationship with me as much, especially as they know my pro-Zionist views. But those Zionist views that I have come essentially from 2 fronts. One is personal observation and sorting through all of the nonsense that the media tells people. And the second is biblical. I think that's an important thing for you to understand. I unapologetically look at the Middle East from the lens of a person who believes in Holy Scripture, believes the Bible to be absolutely the truth. And that also helps to formulate my views. When you hear that Israel is firing bombs into Gaza, understand they didn't just wake up one day and say, let's get our fighters and our bombers assembled, and let's go over and blow some stuff up in Gaza. Frankly, the Israelis don't care that much about Gaza's existence, to the degree that after the Oslo Accords, they pulled out completely of Gaza. They had the whole thing. It was theirs. They had it in toto. And there were over 10,000 Jews living in Gaza. And one of the things that Ariel Sharon did, which turned out to be a disastrous mistake, was that he made an agreement. He would pull all the Jews out of Gaza and let the Palestinians have it. Here you are. It's all yours. You hear this thing. Why didn't Israel give up land for peace? That's exactly what they did. And since they did that, they gave up the land. They've never had a moments of peace with Gaza. And part of the reason is because when the Palestinians got control of Gaza, guess who they elected to run the place? Hamas. Now, please understand, Hamas is not a legitimate government organization. Hamas is, by the State Department standards and definition, a terrorist organization. It is labeled that way by our own State Department. And by the way, that was true. Didn't matter whether Barack Obama was president, George Bush was president, or whether Donald Trump was president, or for that matter, whether Joe Biden is president. Hamas is still labeled a terrorist group. They're not a government, but they run Gaza. And as they have done from time to time, most recently in 2014, they decided just to indiscriminately start launching volleys of rockets into civilian territory, trying to kill Israelis. They rarely launch them, if ever, into areas that are heavily populated by Palestinians who are living in Israel. They don't go into Jerusalem. They stay away from Ramallah. They don't hit those areas. And the reason is obvious. They'd be killing their own countrymen. What do they go after? They go after Sderot down in the south, Ashkelon. They go after Tel Aviv. They go after the areas where they're heavily populated with Jewish residents. And in this last skirmish, all-out war, they've launched well over 2,000 rockets and aimed them at civilian territory. Now, there's a big difference in how Hamas approaches this conflict and how Israel does. Hamas will send as many rockets as possible, trying to kill as many civilians as possible. The Israelis take extraordinary measures to avoid civilian casualties in Gaza. And I'm going to describe some of those that I witnessed firsthand very soon. In just a moment, I'm going to tell you about that. But I want you to get a clear picture. And again, this is not something I'm just making up. This is not propaganda. I've seen it with my own eyes. Hamas will put their army behind children and civilians. Israel puts their army in front of children and civilians. Hamas doesn't really care how many children and civilians get killed, because it's a great tool of propaganda for them when they can bring out bodies of babies, bodies of children, bodies of women, and say, look what those horrible Israelis have done. What they don't tell you is that Hamas strategically and intentionally locates their rocket launchers in properties that are also shared by schools, hospitals, apartment buildings where people live, and in other facilities where it is almost inevitable that in order to destroy the rocket launch facility, there will be civilians at risk. So what the Israelis do, for which they get no credit at all, they take extraordinary means to warn the people in a building or in a neighborhood, get the heck out of here. We're about to blow this place up. In 2014, the last big conflict between Gaza and Israel, my wife and I flew to Israel in the midst of it because I was frankly very frustrated that Barack Obama was giving this typical equivalency nonsense about, well, both sides need to calm down, both sides need to back off, both sides, as if they were equally at fault. And the truth is, there was nothing that Israel initiated. Hamas initiated it by trying to kill Israeli citizens, and Israel is not going to stand by. Folks, they've been through a Holocaust. They almost got wiped out completely. Had Hitler had his way, and had God not intervened, there wouldn't be a single Jew living on the planet today. So when you tell the Jews, we're going to come kill you, they take you seriously. And they are never going to allow themselves to be rolled over on again. They've seen it, they've felt it, they're still survivors of it. And the one thing you can count on, to the last drop of blood and the last breath in their lungs, the Jewish people, and specifically the Israelis, are not going to just allow someone to come and slaughter them as what happened to them in the Holocaust. So clearly get that mindset. In 2014, when my wife and I went to Israel, and we went down on the Gaza border, and one of the things we did, we spent a day with the Israeli Defense Force Air Force at their southernmost base, from which they were launching all of the bomb raids into Gaza with their F-16s. We spent the day not only visiting with their pilots, their crews, their commanders. We were given virtually unlimited access for information. Some things, obviously, we could not photograph. Many things we could not tell because it would breach security. But we were given an unusual level of clearance. And one of the things that we observed firsthand was when the Israelis are preparing to go in and, let's say, take out a building because it's where rockets are being launched. First, they go over, they fly with either drones or high aircraft, and they drop tens of thousands of leaflets that litter the neighborhood and tell people in Arabic, get out of here. You're in a target zone. You must leave by 10 a.m. or whatever the time is. And following that, they send a text message. Now, the Israeli technology is stunning. It's absolutely phenomenal. They send a text message to every phone, and by the way, everybody in Gaza has one. They send a text message and they say, this area is targeted. Get out. If you value your life, we cannot guarantee that your safety will be protected after 10 o'clock this morning. Get out. And after that, they do what's called a knock on the roof. They fly over, they drop an incendiary but not lethal device on the roof. It makes enough noise and it creates enough of a distraction that anybody in that building gets the point. They're about to blow us up. They're not kidding. The Israelis, with very sophisticated drones, are watching in real time, and they physically count the number of people that run out of the building. And they specifically look for children and others. Their intelligence is such, they have a pretty good idea of how many people are in that building at the time they do the knock on the roof. And when they've counted, and they feel like that all of the people are out of that building, then they give a green light to their pilots who fly over with the F-16s and the bombs. They drop them, they destroy the target. And if there are people still in that building, it's because Hamas rushed them back in, which they have done. They have taken children and innocent civilians against their will and put them in buildings that they know are going to be blown up for the express purpose of the propaganda impact. What I'm telling you, I know some of you are scratching your head, oh, there's no way. Oh, yes, there is a way. That's how they do it. Their value of human life is not what yours is. They believe that if someone dies for the cause, it's a worthy death. It's fine. And even if that someone is unwilling, like a child, it's okay to kill a child if it's for the cause. And by the way, for the liberals who whine and moan and scream, oh, no, it's terrible. Liberals don't mind killing 63 million unborn children since 1973 in the mother's womb because they thought that was justified. I don't want to hear them tell me how evil the Israelis are, because the truth is Hamas could save every single one of those lives if they wanted to. The fact is, they don't want to. Hamas puts civilians as close to the action as possible because it is in their best interest for civilians to be killed. Yes, I know what I'm saying sounds absolutely preposterous. It's just the fact. And I was stunned when I watched in real time, the video of the Israelis taking great precautions to try to prevent any civilian deaths. And even after the pilot's been given a green light, if he's flying over and he senses, detects, or sees anything that gives him pause about maybe killing innocent civilians, he also has the full authority to back off that mission and to fly home. Now, over the weekend, there was a lot of news stories about a building in which the Associated Press and Al Jazeera had their news headquarters, and it was blown up. And you have the AP running around, oh my gosh, they targeted the news building. Oh, the press is at risk. That is a bunch of crap. Forgive my French, but that is crap. The AP and Al Jazeera were warned. They were warned that the building they were in housed Hamas. And frankly, they knew it before. And they stayed there anyway. And they got out before it was blown up. But then they pretend that, oh, we had no idea. We didn't know. Yes, you did. Because the Israelis told you that. So for all the hand-holding and pearl clutching that you hear from the Associated Press, which used to be a legitimate news organization, it is a joke now, a total joke, a disgraced, disgusting propaganda machine. And Al Jazeera always has been. I just want you to grasp that what you're going to hear out of the news media regarding the war between Israel, a legitimate government, where the people elect their own leaders, and Hamas, which is a terror organization by every definition of our U.S. government, there is not going to be an honest reporting coming from most of the news sources. And I want to remind you of something that I hope you really fully understand. When you hear about the Palestinians, I think surely you do know there is no such thing as a Palestinian nation. And the very term Palestinian is a made-up term that was created in 1962 by Yasser Arafat to create an aggrieved people because he wanted to destroy Israel, and he figured if he could maybe create a people and tell them that they were being mistreated and give them an identity, maybe he could use it as sort of a pressure against the world. And he did quite well with that. Yasser Arafat himself was a terrorist. He was behind a number of terrorist attacks that murdered people, innocent people. A horrible human being. Now, some of you are going to say, that's reckless for you to say that about the, quote, Palestinians. Then answer me this. Who was the first Palestinian president? Who was the first Palestinian king? Where are the roots of the so-called Palestinians geographically? Now, if you think that I'm being harsh by saying they're a made-up term and it's really not a nationality or an ethnicity, let me put you on a little search. Downstream, download, buy, do whatever you got to do to get the movie Exodus. It was produced in 1961. I think Otto Preminger may have been the producer of it, starring Paul Newman. If you're old, like me, you will remember the movie. It's a blockbuster movie, Exodus, and it was about Jews trying to come to the land of what? Palestine. After the Second World War, people who had survived the Holocaust in Europe. Now, the reason I'm telling you this is because if you watch the movie, one of the things that may be a little startling to you when you catch it is that when Paul Newman, who is Jewish in the movie, when he is talking about the Jewish people, you know what he calls them? Palestinians. Why does he call them that? Because the term Palestinian was not an ethnicity. It was not about a race or a geopolitical group. It designated people who lived in a certain geographical region, the land of Palestine, which goes back to the term of the first century, Philistine. It was a term that the Romans gave to the Jews in the first century when they were murdering them and running them out of Jerusalem. It was a term of derision, labeling the something that they would have hated, being called a Philistine. And that's the origin of the term Palestine or Palestinian. Yasser Arafat grabbed that name in 1962 and attached it to a group of people who were largely, for the most part, Bedouins, nomads, who roamed the land taking care of sheep and flocks of cattle and lambs and other animals. And they pretty much had access all over the Middle East. And most of them, if they had any ethnic or origin, it was either Jordanian or Egyptian. And yet they declared themselves to be Palestinian. There were those who were merchants and lived obviously in the cities, and many of them had businesses that thrived in Jerusalem and Bethlehem and other places. I've known through the years some wonderful people who were Arab, many of them Arab Christian. I'm just saying to you that this idea that the Palestinians lived there forever and were in charge of the government and ran the place for thousands of years, and then those nasty Jews came in and boogered it all up for them, that is just not true. There is such an anti-Semitism that goes on in our world today. Absolute, downright Jew-hating. It's frightening. It's disturbing. I don't understand it. To me, it's irrational. I think it's evil. I think the only explanation is that it is demonic, because there is no rational reason that people would just naturally hate Jews. Why did Hitler hate Jews? Why did he murder 6 million of them? I don't know. It makes no sense. But it's real. I've got a good friend, Mike Evans. Mike has built one of the most amazing places in Jerusalem called the Friends of Zion Museum. And in that, it's a state-of-the-art, high-tech facility in which he depicts in the most amazing ways that would make Disney blush with guilt, or not guilt, but envy, how Christian people have been instrumental in helping to facilitate the return of Jews to their homeland, which God gave them 4,000 years ago at the time of Abraham. Mike Evans has created a Facebook page called the Jerusalem Prayer Team. There's over 70 million followers of Jerusalem Prayer Team. And it's not a political page. It's obviously pro-Israel and pro-Zionist. It's been shut down. And why? Because some so-called Palestinians have said that it was unfair in promoting an Israeli point of view. And so Mike Evans now cannot communicate with over 70 million people who decided to be a part of his Facebook page, who wanted to be, through the Jerusalem Prayer Team, because somebody whined to Facebook. And it is this type of censorship and a blanket put over the truth that ought to really be disturbing to every single person who cares about freedom and about freedom of speech, but also about the balance of power in the Middle East and the rest of the world. Now, one thing you're going to hear, and you will maybe wonder, why are there fewer Israeli casualties than there are casualties in Gaza? There's always a vast difference. There'll be 6 or 7 Israeli casualties, 140 casualties in Gaza. Well, there's several reasons. Let me list them. One is because Israel, they take the money, they have high tax rates, and they build things like the Iron Dome defense system, which is just amazing. And over 90% of the rockets that are launched from Gaza never hit the target, never come down and hit anything, because the Iron Dome fires a missile at the rocket and it blows it up in midair and nothing gets hurt, no one gets injured. That's part of it. 90% of those rockets don't even hit the ground. Second reason, Israel insists that every single building in Israel has a bomb shelter. If you live in an apartment building, there's a bomb shelter there. If you go to work in an office building, there's a bomb shelter there. Because they are used to the idea that people are trying to kill them. Every playground has a bomb shelter. It is by law. So they do a better job of protecting themselves. They have a very extensive warning system where sirens go off no matter what time of the day or night. And they get their people out of harm's way. And families quickly gather their children. They get them to the bomb shelters. If they're in a school, they get them to the bomb shelters. And so it's much harder to kill the Israelis because of their defense system. With Hamas, they rush and get a baby carriage with a baby in it and take it down to where they think the target is going to be so that they can find maybe the rubble of the building with a baby in it and then hold it up and say, look what those Jews did. That sounds harsh. It sounds unfair. It is the God's truth. And if you don't believe it, then you're watching way too much MSNBC and CNN and believing the crap from the New York Times and most of the American media. I am saying all of this because I want you to fully grasp that not only is it important that we stand with Israel, because Israel most mirrors our own country where we elect our leaders. We have freedom of speech. We can criticize the government. I can criticize Joe Biden or anybody in the government, and chances are I will not be assassinated for that or put in prison. Try that in the so-called Palestinian areas, and maybe you'll never be seen again. I just want you to grasp what's happening. And when you hear the media tell you what's going on there, don't believe it until you can verify it with several eyewitnesses. And I'm telling you now that most of what you will ever get out of the Middle East is a pack of lies. It does matter. It matters a lot. And I hope you will receive this message in the manner and in the spirit in which it is intended. My special guest today, and I'm really delighted to have him, Alex Marlow. He was the very first person that Andrew Breitbart ever hired in what would become quite a media empire. And Andrew Breitbart, a brilliant guy, character, to say the least, left us too soon, but he also left us with a terrific media legacy. And Alex Marlow has been a big part of that. And I'm very happy to have him join me now. He's got a blockbuster book just out called Breaking the News. And this one ought to break the record book. I hope you get a copy, because if you wonder why the media is so very biased and untrustworthy, and you'd really like to know, why is that? Get this book, Breaking the News. Very happy, Alex, to have you join me. Thank you. And let's dive into this. This is some explosive stuff.
Governor, thank you so much. And you're a fan favorite on my morning show on Sirius XM K3 channel. And I was, we broken some news together over the years, I think, on that show. So it's great to be on yours. And thanks for returning the favor. I really appreciate that. But I think this book is big. And it goes even deeper than your typical book on liberal bias. I think we've kind of all been coached up in that regard. And if you don't see it, it's because you choose to. I think this takes it a step forward, and it's very fitting we're doing this interview in podcast form, because that's the type of people that I think can save us, because we're not just fighting against liberal bias. We're now fighting against an entrenched corporate media establishment that's not just doing the bidding of the globalists and the far left, but they're also doing the bidding of these mega conglomerates, which people can see this day to day. They're increasingly the drivers of the left-wing agenda in America and beyond. And the book really breaks that down, but it's not just analysis. There's a lot of breaking news in it that people will see, and I'll get a lot of it out at Breitbart.com, but hopefully people pick it up. But there's a lot of investigative reporting that went into the book, and I got to be honest with you, Mike, I was so shocked at what I found.
I think that was one of the takeaways I had, was that you went into it knowing that the media had a certain left-leaning bias, but what you have described, that this is not just some people who couldn't get away from their college liberalism.
Right.
There is a marriage between the corporate structure of the country and world and the way the media treats news stories. I mean, I see it across the spectrum, and television can be rather shallow. 2 minutes, move on, 2 minutes, move on, 2 minutes, and it's hard to get any depth. What you've done for us in this is to give us the depth and the background, and I think that's what's important. And when you mentioned that left-leaning corporatism, give us some examples that I think will shock our listeners in terms of the marriage. I mean, it's not just a hand-holding. This marriage has been consummated between big corporations and the media.
Yeah, this is a perfect thing to discuss, because there's so many examples of these. They're happening in virtually every newsroom. But first, let's think about it as a bigger concept. Like NBC News. We all know NBC News is liberal, but is that really the whole picture? NBC News is part of NBC Comcast Universal, which is this giant multinational corporation with international interests. And every time a topic comes up that a journalist who makes a 5-figure salary and might live in a 2-bedroom apartment in DC, these people are not making decisions that are going to jeopardize that entire international business. It's just illogical for them to do that. And yet that is such a huge percentage of the media we take in. Again, why I start with independent journalism has to be the future. But if you think of it like that, that's every single entity. Look at what happened just the other day with another major merger with AT&T and Time Warner and Discovery and CNN, and they're all under the same umbrella. And this is just more conflicts of interest, and more organizations get bought up by international organizations. There's a good example that I go through in the book where the main media reporter at the New York Times, a guy named Ben Smith, he's a guy who covers the media columnist, the preeminent media writer. Ben Smith was the editor-in-chief of BuzzFeed, and he was well known for that. And he was the guy who published the PP dossier, that bogus dossier about Donald Trump that led to so many of the investigations and so much time wasted by you and me and all of us in the media over all those years. And a lot of it had to do with this guy's decision-making. He got promoted, essentially. He failed upwards to the New York Times media columnist. Now, Ben Smith has a stake in BuzzFeed. He swore that he would, or he promised he would sell it by last year. He has not sold it. At least he hasn't sold it since I turned my book in, because I asked him right before I turned it in if he sold it, and he admitted he hadn't. So, and then he directed me to New York Times corporate. Imagine that. But here's the other thing. BuzzFeed is invested in by NBC and others. Ben reports on NBC, but never knows that NBC has a huge stake in BuzzFeed where Ben has shares. So you're getting a guy who's writing on topics that it's so incestuous because he's making money off of the outlet that he covers. He discloses when he writes about BuzzFeed, but he doesn't disclose when he writes about NBC. I don't know why that is. I asked him about it, and he kind of punted the ball in the other direction. But this is what's happening throughout every newsroom in America. It's just a matter of investigating it and turning over those stones.
It's really stunning that there's not that level of disclosure, because most media outlets would require some level of disclosure to say, for example, I know at the Fox News Channel, if they mention the Wall Street Journal, they have to say the Wall Street Journal, which is owned by our parent company, News Corp. And yet what you're saying is that this relationship, Ben Smith, New York Times, BuzzFeed, all in a nice little circle, NBC involved, and there is no disclosure that they're all connected. And you mentioned incestuous. I'm thinking incestuous may mean two people. This is like an orgy of media.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. And I'm trying to be respectful of anyone in the audience who's with family.
But I mean, I'm sorry I'm giving that image to people, but honestly, that's what came to mind when you're describing all these partners that are weaving in and out of the relationship that's supposed to be a pure media. And Alex, what you're describing, there's nothing pure about this.
And one thing I want to tease for the audience, because I would like for them to pick up the book, but I have identified a philanthropist in the big tech world. And this individual funds establishment media on the left that you've all read and you've all come into contact with. This person funds activist media on the left that has essentially the same agenda, but is much more in-your-face, pugilistic, viral, millennial-oriented content. And she funds the top Democratic politicians. So there's one person who's funding all of these types of left-wing activism, and they all work synergistically. And no one points out who these philanthropists are, and they just call them philanthropists, and they move on. They don't know that these people are really running vast networks of orgiastic or orgiastic. We'd have to look that up afterwards. But that is what it is, and that's what I reveal, and that's why it's so much more than bias. We get it. You're liberal. You want Democrats to win. It's so much worse, Governor, and that's why we're getting this cancel culture where they're trying to kick us off the internet, because that was the goal all along. It was never to work with us and to convince us. It was always to either convert us 100% or try to throw us offline. This is the message, and it's why we all need to get activated right now.
I think your readers of the book, Breaking the News, are going to appreciate that you don't make wild allegations and generic claims. You give names, places, specifics. I found one of the most intriguing analysis was about meeting the press. And let's just pick one. Chuck Todd, who hosts the show, Meet the Press. And gosh, what a unfortunate replacement for Tim Russert, who did have some journalistic chops, even if he had his own opinions. He largely, I found Tim to keep those to himself when he was interviewing somebody. He was tough on everybody. Chuck Todd was a blogger, and not a very good one, and then he suddenly becomes host of this show. But what I did not know, and you revealed it in the book, were the many relationships that, first of all, he has his own wife is a Democrat operative, and then he rents his property, a rental property, to Senator Klobuchar. I mean, this kind of stuff is a little bit uncomfortable, isn't it?
It's great, and you've got a great eye. This is one of my favorite parts of the book. This is where we knew that Chuck Todd, of course, is a Democrat, and there are these rumors that he had actually rented. He was the landlord for Amy Klobuchar, which I think popped up. I think it was in the New York Post once, but then it kind of came and went. It seemed like a big deal to me, but it kind of came and went in the news cycle. And then we looked into it, and I had one of my researchers, who's a very talented guy. I had to pay him a time and a half pay for this, Governor, to go through it. I made him watch 7 interviews, full interviews of Chuck Todd and Amy Klobuchar to see if he would disclose at all that she was his tenant, his literal tenant, or as I think another word, maybe his roommate. Who knows? I think and it never disclosed. And we're laughing about it, but we really shouldn't be crying about it. This is insane that this is happening in our country, and that the entire establishment media is not interested in uncovering this stuff.
Well, there are some other things in that particular chapter that I found interesting. The incestuous relationship, for example, that you've got with Chris Cuomo. Obviously, his brother's the governor of New York. That's some issue. But this is so, I don't know. I mean, Jake Tapper's wife, you revealed her to be somebody who has been an activist with Planned Parenthood. I mean, how do you claim objectivity when you have people that you're married to who are that intricately involved in a very partisan political issue? I'm stunned to think that.
You can't, and it's really interesting to look at the Cuomos in the sense of the coronavirus, which my description of the coronavirus, the chapter is called the Trump virus, and the reason is because the media tried to frame this as Donald Trump's problem, not a China problem, not a problem with all of those Democrats who wanted us to not be racist and not be xenophobic at the start of the pandemic. And it's not about the widespread globalism going unchecked. None of that is a factor. The only thing that matters is that Donald Trump could be framed for it, essentially, and it could be used to defeat him. And during that process, they got so brazen with their partisanship. And one of the stunning things to look into is the relationship between Chris Cuomo and Andrew Cuomo. Now, Andrew Cuomo's nursing home scandal was really simmering in the press for a while, and it did not get elevated until finally the Attorney General of the state, who's also a Democrat, started looking into it. But this was happening, and conservative media circles were talking about it, that this guy had this policy of cramming sick patients into facilities that could not handle the patients with the most vulnerable Americans, period, elderly people in nursing homes, which nursing homes are already not great places in general for the most part. Not to say there aren't some exceptions. And to cram people who are sick in with those people was so cruel. It was so monstrous. And one of the primetime hosts on CNN is the little brother of the guy who's doing it, which means at a minimum they can't cover it. But of course, Governor, they went so much worse than that. They tried to portray Andrew Cuomo as a hero. And they had prop comedy segments with Chris Cuomo holding up a gigantic cotton swabs to make fun of Governor Cuomo getting the coronavirus test, where you used to scratch the back of your brain with a Q-tip, which we've all had at this point. It's all very unpleasant. And they were making it into a joke. In the meantime, all these New Yorkers were dying on his watch. And what happened? He gets a mega book deal. The press fawns all over him. The companies are printing his name on women's underwear. In the meantime, I contrasted with the state of Florida, which stayed largely open, which let businesses stay open, which had fewer mask mandates, and did noticeably better with the virus despite having a very large population of elderly people. And this stuff is all in the data if you want to look into it. The problem is the establishment media would not report on it.
There's a particular point of the book that I found interesting, and in part because it involved my daughter, who was White House press secretary under Donald Trump for a while. And it had to do with the allegation that Donald Trump said that the military was filled with losers. And I remember when that came out, how angry she was because she never heard it. And you go through with having Sarah and Stephen Miller and Hogan Gidley, who used to work for me, by the way. I feel like he's almost like a fourth child of mine because I almost darn near raised the guy. So I'm watching these people. These are people I know. And I know full well that if Donald Trump had ever said the military were losers, they'd have walked out. John Kelly would have walked out. And he, who did not end up getting along with Donald Trump in the end, four-star general, distinguished individual, he denied that it had ever happened. But the media continues to say, even to this day, that Donald Trump said the military, people who volunteer to go and serve and potentially die for the country, are losers. It simply never happened. How do they get away with this?
It's amazing, and the story is even worse than that. This is one of the parts of the book that is, I think, one of the most interesting to read. Again, I think you're highlighting some really great sections. But the suckers and losers story was, I think, the single fakest piece of news in the entire 2020 election cycle. You had 4 unnamed sources who said that Trump had called our military dead suckers and losers, and that he would not go to honor them at a cemetery in France because he didn't want to mess up his hair. That was literally the narrative. It sounds so absurd, but it came from The Atlantic, which is a glossy publication that is respected in certain circles. And the byline on it was a guy named Jeffrey Goldberg, who's the editor-in-chief. So a guy who had interviewed Obama a million times on foreign policy. And he's not my type of guy or your type of guy, I'm sure, Governor, but he's the type of guy who resonates with certain people as credible. And it was not a single name source was in there. And then at Breitbart, we started trying to talk to people who had direct knowledge of it, including your daughter, including Hogan, who is a friend, and I've interviewed 100 times probably, and not to mention others who were not necessarily pro-Trump. John Bolton comes to mind as someone who refuted the story. And then finally, the right hand of John Kelly. And we all know that John Kelly and Donald Trump didn't get along in the White House or out of the White House. But the suggestion is that John Kelly, who's a Gold Star dad whose son died in Afghanistan, that he would allow for Donald Trump to call military dead suckers and losers. And the assumption The Atlantic made is that John Kelly stood there and did nothing. This is a huge impingement on John Kelly's character. He's being slandered if this story is true, but we know it's not true. But the story gets even worse. You wake up the morning after the story. There's an ad already cut about the story that appears on Morning Joe the next day. The Biden administration, the Biden campaign does a press conference. Who gets the first question? It's The Atlantic. They get the next question. This is where it is orgiastic. This is where it's not just The Atlantic. It's MSNBC. It's the Democratic Party. And if there wasn't collusion here, I would be totally stunned.
Mm. You know, these kind of things that are just filled in the book. I mean, it's an amazing book. And I want all of our listeners to understand, if you're saying, well, Alex is just, using some third-party hearsay. There's over 100 pages of documented notes at the end of the book. I looked and I said, I've never seen a book that has this many footnotes, that has time, place, date, source material. You want to find out where he got this stuff? 100-plus pages of notes at the end to reveal it. I think that's pretty significant. Alex, the mainstream media, they hate Breitbart. They always have. And they try to marginalize you as being out there on the edge and not being really a part of the journalistic community, which I think maybe you should take as a badge of distinct honor. But tell me what it is that Breitbart does that makes the media's heads explode.
It's such a great question, because we make their heads explode for a number of reasons. Again, you're so kind. It really means the world to me, having been the admirer of yours for so long as a communicator. And that's right. There is over 100 pages in there. It's 1,200 in total. And the whole goal was, I'm good friends with Peter Schweitzer, who I think is the best investigative reporter who wrote Clinton Cash and Profiles in Corruption, some of the others. And I wanted to beat Peter. I think his last one had 1,100. So I wanted to go for 1,200, just so and I'm going to send a copy direct to Media Matters so that they can fact check it and they can go through all the 1,200 and see where I got some stuff wrong. I think they're going to have a hard time. But there's a couple of things that Breitbart does that I think is particularly irritating to people. First of all, that we actually get stories. And if people read this book, I think the parts that are more kind of piecing things back together and historical and analytical, I think you'll enjoy. But I really want you to pick it up for the news. There's actually news in here. There's news. There's dozens of stories that you won't have heard before, and many that no one has ever heard before. And these are fully reported things. And I think this is something that really bothers, because it's not hot take lean. It's not just commentary. I love commentary, but it is reporting. And that's something that the right has traditionally not been as good at as the left. The other thing we do is we have a lot of fun. We try to laugh along with our stories, because we do think that that's a much more charismatic way to present conservative values. It's not to do it with a bow tie and elbow patches. Sometimes the best way to do it is with a smile and a joke. I know you know this well, and I know this is part of your messaging over the years, so I think that won't surprise you, that that's part of our strategy, is to make things fun. We also move very quickly, which means they have to work very hard to keep up with us. But I think overall, the thing that they hate about us the most is that we understand what I talked about earlier, which is that we're not going to back down. We're not going to stop fighting because people get mad at us and send us some tweets that we don't like. We are not going to be intimidated by people who are richer and more powerful than we are. And they're not used to that. The left and the establishment are used to people eventually coming around, either getting bought off or being intimidated to shut down. And we've never been that way. It comes from our founder, Andrew, but it's lasted throughout our tenure here at Breitbart. And that's something I'm very proud to maintain that legacy.
Gosh, there's so many things I want to get to, and we're going to run out of time. So let me throw some quickly.
Sure.
And bounce them back to me. I thought it was fascinating when you brought up the Ronan Farrow journalistic efforts to expose Harvey Weinstein and others who were just flat out guilty, of sexual harassment and using people. Yet Ronan got the heave-ho because he had the audacity to tell the truth on people that were powerful.
Yeah, this is very interesting, and something I think will really surprise people who are liberal is that I really defend Ronan Farrow's Me Too reporting. And I think a lot of people, you really see that I paint a picture of the culture in the NBC newsroom as one that had protected predatory men, or at least appears to have protected them on a consistent basis. And I use example after example. And even if there were a few people in that group who were falsely accused or their accusations were exaggerated, the knee jerk in the NBC newsroom was never believe all women. It was always attack the messenger. And Ronan Farrow was working at NBC and had these bombshell reports that were out there. And the NBC did everything they could so that they couldn't run, suggesting they didn't meet NBC's journalistic standards. The network or the governor, there was probably 100 examples of fake news put out by NBC listed in the book. There's probably another 250 that I cut because they were redundant with stuff that other people had reported. They report falsehoods all the time. But when it comes to Ronan Farrow's fully documented Pulitzer Prize-winning report on Harvey Weinstein, that somehow didn't make the grade. Why not? And my theory is that it is the culture there about protecting predatory men. And that's what I lay out in pretty significant detail. And to come full circle in our conversation, Ben Smith, who, again, in the New York Times, a media columnist with stake in BuzzFeed, which has huge investment from NBC, he wrote an article condemning Ronan Farrow's reports on NBC. Does not disclose that he's tied to NBC as well. This is what we're dealing with.
John Meacham was brought up, and I found this very interesting because Meacham is one of the many smug anti-Trumpers who, throughout the election process, just sort of harumphed anything involving Trump,
yes.
Considered all the people who voted for him to be essentially hillbillies and fools. And it turns out that he praised a speech by Joe Biden as so good. By golly, no wonder he did. Because later it was disclosed he wrote the doggone speech. I mean, that's the most unethical thing I've ever heard.
I know. It's amazing. And Meacham is a perfect casting for NBC because he's essentially everything he says is Trump bad, Democrats good. But he says it in this way, the sort of professorial, smug way, which, again, resonates with a certain type of American that I don't think your message or mine is hitting very hard, Governor. But there are certain Americans that are impressed by that sort of thing, that if you can say very simplistic stuff about Trump but sound sophisticated as you do it, that's his brand. But yes, he heaped praise on a speech he wrote on live TV. And then he was, this for some reason was the third rail, and he was removed from NBC from this. Even they thought this crossed the line. But they did say he's allowed to come back as an unpaid guest. He just can't be paid to compliment his own speeches. Maybe he can compliment them in the future, but he's just not going to get a paycheck for it. But I found this hilarious for a number of reasons. First of all, you laid it out very well. But the fact that this, of all the things I document in the book, hundreds of instances of impropriety, this is maybe the only firing that, and it wasn't even necessarily a firing, it was more like a non-contract extension that took place. This was the only one where MSNBC actually ousted someone.
Well, it is a absolute fascinating read, and it's an important one. And I hope our listeners will get online today and order the book, have it delivered, or go to a bookstore and pick it up. There may be some bookstores that'll try to ban this book because they don't want you to know what's in it. But it's the book Breaking the News by Alex Marlow, and it will break your mind in exposing the way in which the media is attempting to manipulate the American public. So many examples of it. Again, it is extraordinarily well documented. The media will hate this book. They'll do everything they can to discredit it. But they've got to get their scissors out and take out the last 112 pages, which is filled with notes and details of where this information can be obtained. Alex, I want to just say thank you for joining me. Thank you for writing the book. And I hope that you will sleep with one eye open every night, because I have a feeling there'll be people out to get you, my friend.
Thanks, Governor. Yeah, I do name names in this, and you've been very generous with your kind words and your great platform, and it's always a treat to talk to you, and I'm happy to come back anytime you like.
I'd love to visit again. Alex Marlow, the book again, Breaking the News. I hope you'll get it today. Speaking of breaking the news, I wish somebody would break the absolute monopoly of the news. The nonsense that passes itself off as legitimate journalism. Folks, journalism is dead. I'm sure you maybe understand that. I hope you do. You just can't trust journalists. And I'm going to give you one of the most important reasons that you may not have thought about. But I say this every time I speak to a group of students at a high school or a college. There used to be a time when a reporter would go out and gather information for a story, would write the story, and then would submit it to a series of editors. There would be a copy editor who would check for things like grammar and syntax to make sure that it was in the proper language and style, and that verb-subject agreement was enforced. And it was just a matter of sort of the technical copy, not for the content so much, but just for the style and to make sure that it was grammatically correct. then it would often go to a second editor. If it was a story about the city, it would go to the city editor, who would then look at it and say, okay, here's the story about the mayor and a police chief and what they're getting into, and how do we know this is true? And the reporter would have to say, well, here are my sources. And if the sources were not firsthand, the city editor would say, we can't say that. We can't say that because you don't have enough sources. You have one person talking off the record. That's not enough. I want two sources on the record. I want their names, and I want them to stand by what they said. That didn't happen. The story wouldn't run. And then you would ultimately have at least a managing editor. Sometimes there would be yet another editor, but a managing editor would take a look at the story, and he would decide, or she, whether or not that story had significance and consequence. And the managing editor would generally, in a committee meeting, decide where it gets placed. Is it page 1? Is it page B6? Where does this story get placed? And if it's a really explosive story, it'll go all the way to the publisher, and the publisher will decide whether this story gets run. Now, that's what I'm trying to describe. This is how it used to be, and a journalist gathered information, but he doggone well, or she, had better be able to present that story with sources that are impeccable and unimpeachable. And if the journalist doesn't have that, the story doesn't run. Today, the journalist goes out, usually has a point of view, writes the point of view, makes a couple of calls to, quote, anonymous sources, highly placed. That's one I love. Highly placed may be that they clean the floors on the top floor of the building. And therefore, they're highly placed. I've seen this nonsense. I watched it so often when my daughter was the press secretary at the White House, and they would talk about some, leak that came from a senior official. That might mean the person's age, may not have anything to do with the fact he had never met the president ever in his life, didn't even work in the White House West Wing, worked in either the executive office building or didn't even work on site. Yet the news media would quote him, not by name, of course. And so then the journalist writes this story, the so-called journalist, and says, I have sources. They're always unnamed, and they're usually not depicted as a particular position they hold. But the reporter puts that story online immediately. There is no editor. And sometimes there may be a correction, but most of the time, no correction, even when the story is a bunch of bull butter. And therefore, I'm saying to you, journalism is dead. And what I say to students is simply this: you must be your own editor. You must carry out the function of what an editor used to do for you. You don't have anyone doing that now. So just because you read it on the internet, that does not make it so. And you must ask the questions that an editor would ask. Where'd you get this story? Who are the sources? What are their names? What positions do they hold? How close to the source are they? Is this something they heard third person in the hallway? Somebody texted them something? Nobody's on the record? Then toss it out. It means nothing. It's gossip. Total gossip. You must be your own editor. And it's one of the things I think we are learning more and more, but I don't know if enough Americans are, and I don't think young Americans are understanding it. And they just take it at face value if they see it on CNN, or read it in the New York Slimes, or as I called it, the Washington Compost. And I've noticed other people are picking up those designations. I started saying that years ago, New York Slimes and Washington Compost. Now, a lot of people say it. Guess where they got it? They got it from me. They did. That's okay. I'd rather be copied than ignored. Speaking of being ignored, I don't want to ignore your time. I'm so grateful that you've been with me on this edition of the People's Podcast. It's been fun. Great content. At least I feel it has been, and I'm pretty sure you feel the same way. That's exactly why you're going to tell your friends and neighbors to join you on the People's Podcast every week by going to quakemedia.com/Mike. And I hope you'll be watching my television show on TBN, the Trinity Broadcasting Network, Saturdays, 8 and 11 Eastern, 7:10 Central. And again on Sundays, it comes on at 9 o'clock Eastern, 8 o'clock Central. Also, it is aired on Newsmax at noon Eastern on Sundays. And you can get it online anytime, on demand, Huckabee.tv. Each segment, the entire show, and you should be watching every week. Don't? Shame on you. Get with the program. All right, that's it for now. Thanks so much for joining me. I look forward to being with you next time for another edition of the People's Podcast. This is Mike Huckabee. Good day, and God bless.